All right, here we go with the first game of our Climbing the Ladder series, reaching the intermediate level. If you've already watched the Beating Beginners course, you know exactly how this works. We're going to walk through these games one at a time. This is game number one. We are playing in the shoes of the player with the white pieces. Our rating is 1106, and our opponent is rated 809. We can see that at the top. And we're going to talk through the most important moves of the game to give you a full understanding of how to beat players rated between 800 and 1100. In each game, the ratings will get a little bit higher for our opponents. All right, so we're starting off with 1d4. This is a queen pawn game. And keep in mind the opening principles that we learned in the last course. What are we doing with d4? We're trying to control the center. We're trying to develop the bishop out, get the knights out next, get castled, right? So we always want to remember our opening basics. This is something that I tend to forget sometimes, and I realize, okay, I need to remember not to move a piece twice in the opening, or I need to remember to get my king safer. So we all need to constantly recall these things we learn as beginners. Okay, pawn to d5 by black, symmetric, also fighting for that central control. And now we see knight to c3. This is leading to what's called the Jobava system for white. And the idea is white plays knight c3, bishop f4, and then either pawn to e3, getting that bishop outside of this pawn chain, or sometimes white will play very aggressive. So the knight's guarding this e4 square. White might play for pawn to e4. So that's kind of the idea here. Knight to f6 by black, developing. Bishop to f4. Now we see the Jobava system in place. Pawn to a6 by black. Now I can tell you why black played this, because if they play knight to c6, they realize that knight to b5 is a problem. There's a double attack on that c7 pawn, and there's not a good way to defend it. But it's much stronger to play a move like pawn to c6 here. Use this pawn to guard b5 because this pawn also guards the center, and this creates a nice pawn chain. And black, if they wanted to, they could play e6. If knight to b5 is played now, play knight to a6 to defend this pawn on c7. So if we go back to the game line, pawn to a6 is played, but really this is a very minor inaccuracy because it's not developing anything. So unless black wants to play b5 later, which they do end up playing, I really don't love a6 here. Okay, pawn to e3 by white, another nice developing move. e6 by black, also developing. Keep an eye on this bishop long term. Currently, it's trapped behind this pawn chain. So this is technically a bad bishop right now. It's trapped by its own pawns. Knight to f3. This is looking good. We're developing all of our minor pieces. This bishop's ready to come out soon. Bishop to b4 by black, creating a pin. And one thing to keep in mind, whenever our opponent pins one of our pieces, we always want to look for tactics. Are they able to attack that pinned piece in extra time? Are they able to create any tactical issues for us? At the moment, no pawns can attack this knight. That's a good thing. But we do have to watch out for knight e4. Knight e4 creating a double attack. We need to make sure we're prepared to meet that. Bishop to d3 played. And now if black plays knight to e4, we have a really nice response. We could take the knight, pawn takes back, and play knight to d2. And now this pawn is the weakest pawn on the board, and it's very difficult for black to defend it. All right, so back to the game line. Bishop to d3. We are ready to meet knight e4 by capturing. And now we see pawn to b5 by black. I am not a fan of this move. Look at how white has 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces developed. Black has 2. This is important. We want to get our pieces developed quickly and start to play for control of the center because that gives us a better chance for the tactics to be in our favor later on in the game. Playing b5 puts all of these pawns on light squares with the bad bishop on b7. So black's got to constantly be thinking, how do they get that bishop into the game? So now we play pawn to a3, kicking their bishop, and bishop takes c3 check. Now, at first glance, you might be thinking, why did we allow black to double our pawns, right? Why did we let black create these doubled c-pawns? Well, we have an advantage here. It's called the bishop pair. And as your rating improves, as your rating increases, you will learn to value this bishop pair more and more. And at the very highest levels, on average, the bishop pair is worth half of a pawn. Now, there are a bunch of other factors. That's just a general rule. All things considered, on average, bishop pair can be worth half a pawn. So we do have the bishop pair here. Knight b to d7, developing. Knight to e5. And I'm okay with this move. It's not completely necessary, but I do think it's annoying for black because we're trying to stick the knight here, trapping that queen. So no complaints here. Black plays knight takes e5. And now we take with the d pawn. Again, you might be wondering, why would we take back with the d pawn, accepting another set of double pawns? The idea here is we want to play dynamically. So this pawn on e5 is an awesome attacker. It's kicking the knight off of f6, and the f6 knight defends the pawn on h7, right? So when this knight moves, it's weakening the kingside position, and that's where the black king wants to go hide. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to look to trade off the double pawns. So we could very easily play e4 down the line, trade it for the d pawn, and open up our bishops even more. So this pawn takes pawn is not a bad move. It's also perfectly fine here to take with the bishop. They're both good options. Knight d7 by black. Here we castle. And interestingly, the computer says a strong move here could be queen to g4 or even pawn to h4. And the idea behind those moves is white wants to apply as much pressure on black's kingside as possible. We already talked about how this area is a little bit exposed with the knight retreating. So the computer is saying, well, you could leave the king in the center for now as white and try to put quick pressure on black's kingside. But I have no issue with castling. It's a good way to just get the king to safety. c5 by black, grabbing space. And this would be a perfect moment to play queen g4. Attacking that pawn is very uncomfortable for black. In the game, e4 was played, also a decent move, trying to trade these pawns off like we talked about. But now black missed a strong option. Pawn to c4. Pawn to c4 is good because it makes our bishop leave the defense of this pawn. And then black could consider maybe taking the pawn. So for example, c4, bishop moves, d takes e. But we will eventually scoop this pawn back up as white, and the position's approximately balanced. In the game, bishop to b7 played. Black's developing again. Queen g4. Again, this is the move that's called for. Keep that in mind. When you see a knight retreat off of f6, and their king's still on e8, or even if it's on g8 sometimes, queen to g4 is a great way to bring that extra pressure to the king side. We always want to pressure our opponents and encourage them to make mistakes, pose them with difficult decisions. f3 played in the game. This is just a little bit passive, and it gives black the advantage. c4 would be a good move here again for black. Queen c7 played. So it looks like black's trying to play very solid, double attack this pawn. They're keeping their king's options on the table. Castle kingside, castle queenside. They're both available here. White plays rook to e1. Knight takes e5. And this is a tactical problem. When you see a pin on the board, always look for tactics. So here black really needs to be careful about this move. If they're going to play knight takes e5, they need to be extra sure that they're not going to run into trouble getting that knight pinned to their own queen. And here it is going to run into trouble. Another part of the problem is this king is still in the middle with the rook sitting on e1. So here in the game, white plays e takes d5. That's a great move. It's opening up the rook, creates a double attack on the knight. Both rook and bishop attack it. And this pawn is chipping away at black's pawns in the center, which help defend the king. So black's already in pretty big trouble here. And the first priority for black is, can they defend that knight in extra time? Well, there's only one move. Pawn to f6. That's what they played in the game. And now d takes e6. So we can see the scoreboard at the bottom here below the board. White is up one pawn. This is still pinned. And the king is stuck in the middle for now. Everything is going south for black in this position. Rook to d8 played. I like the idea. Black is trying to counterattack by pinning our bishop. Maybe they'll go c4 and try to attack the pinned piece next. So we have to be aware of that. Queen to e2, getting out of this pin. Pawn c4, so that probably was black's plan. And now bishop to f5. Look at how strong these bishops are. The light bishop defends e6 and attacks h7. The dark bishop pins the knight, points to h6. Both the queen and rook are active on the e file. This is a strong pawn. We just have one rook left to bring into the game. I think that's doing a good job highlighting the value of this bishop pair. Black plays g6. Now, if you notice, black is doing a lot of one-move threats. This was mentioned by Matt Prestige in the notes. Pawn to c4 was a one-move threat on the bishop. This is another one-move threat on the bishop. These one-move threats are very easy for your opponent to counter, especially if it's a game where they have a little bit of time on the clock, like a classical game. You don't really want to make one-move threats like this unless it improves your position overall, or if it's at least neutral with the other options. But here, this move I'm not in love with because it's actually opening up these dark squares. It's weakening these dark squares around the black king. Bishop h3 played, keeping this pawn defended. Pawn to g5, another simple attack mentioned again in our notes. And this is not a good move. This is really opening up the black king. Now we see this diagonal opened. Every time you push a pawn forward, it can't move backwards, and it creates weaknesses behind where the pawn used to be, right? So you push a pawn forward, Yeah, it can attack some things, but it also has a downside. It creates some weaknesses. And in this case, those weaknesses are giving white options to get at the black king. So now bishop takes e5 played. Perfect timing. We see 1, 2, 3 attackers on the knight, 2 defenders. This just makes sense. F takes e, queen takes e, queen takes back, rook takes back. Now look at the scoreboard. White is up 2 pawns. This is a strong pawn. It's defended by bishop and rook. It's a passed pawn, meaning no black pawns can stop it. This pawn is weak with our rook attacking it. With best play, this position is already completely lost for black. So if you put 2 computers head to head, playing both sides here, white's going to win every single time. So now what we want to do from the white side, when we know we're winning, we want to play a strategy where we reduce the chances for our opponent to fight back in the game. That's the main objective right now. We're up 2 pawns. We know we're winning. And that's something that you can train as well. Learning how to evaluate a position correctly. Here, this should be a win. Let's reduce the chances that black fights back. Rook to g8, defending this pawn. Bishop to g4. The idea with bishop to g4 is white just wants to stop black from pawn storming. I don't think this move is completely necessary, and probably bringing the other rook into the game is a little bit stronger, but I'm okay with this move. It is the right idea, trying to reduce counterplay. King e7 by black, blocking this pawn with the king, connecting the rooks. And now we see bishop to h5. Again, though, this neglects the rook on a1. I would much rather see this rook come into the game, either swinging over or maybe playing a4 and trying to trade these pawns and open up the rook that way. Because picture this rook landing on a7. That would be a huge improvement for our rook. So keep developing here if you're playing white. Okay, bishop h5 played. Rook g7. And now we see the other rook come into the game. Rook f1. Good decision. We may play f4 soon, but we needed to get this rook into the game. Rook to d2. From the d2 square, this rook is causing some problems. It's trying to attack the c2 pawn. It's eyeing the pawn on g2. And we play pawn to h3. But what I like about this move, it's setting a trap. The d file is the only open file on the board, right? So that means there's no pawns on the d file. Currently, that rook on d2 controls the open file. We would love to have our rook on d1. h3 actually sets a trap. It's letting black capture the c pawn to try to get our rook into the game. And black goes for it. Interestingly here, rook f to e1 is still the strongest move, but rook to d1 is also good, and I like what white did setting that trap. In the endgame, and I've done a lecture on this for ChessGoals in the past, in the endgame, you want piece activity. Piece activity trumps everything else. So here, it's okay to sacrifice one of our C pawns. We have two of them, knowing that our rook's coming down to D7, attacking the rook, checking the king, attacking the bishop. And once this king gets out of the way, then our E pawn starts marching up the board. That's way more important than capturing a C2 pawn for black. So here black plays bishop to C6. This does not help though, because we find the super strong move rook to C5, hitting the bishop, eyeing C7, which is checking the king with the rook behind it. Black is in some trouble now. They can't move that bishop safely, so they play king takes E6. We take their C6 bishop. With check, the king moves again. Rook E1 check. King moves. Rook takes A6. So now we're +4 on material, and this is where we go conversion mode. There's really not much we need to do in terms of eliminating counterplay from our opponent. I would say the biggest source of counterplay would be if black wins the C pawn and gets the pass pawn rolling. The second biggest source of counterplay would be if they somehow coordinate both rooks to attack our pawn on G2. So those are the two things I would watch out for. Rook takes C3 played. But now we see rook A7. There goes a rook for black. So now the conversion gets very simple. Rook takes A3. Rook to B7, attacking one of their two pass pawns. King moves. We grab an extra pawn. And knowing that we have a bishop and rook to spare, we should always be able to stop these pawns, but you want to make sure they don't get too far advanced. So we should definitely prioritize right now stopping those pawns. B pawn pushes, rook to B1 to attack it, pushes again, bishop to F7. I love this move. Attacks both pawns on the diagonal because most likely we will sacrifice our bishop to help eliminate those pawns, knowing that we have a 3 versus 1 advantage here and an extra rook. King moves, rook H5, ready to pick up another pawn. King moves, we take. So now there's triple connected pass pawns over on the king side. Rook A2. We go back. The reason for this is we want the rook to come behind these pawns, one of these two squares, but the king guards both. We put in the rook all the way back and then we'll swing across. King C3, rook B8. It looks a little bit scary, but it's all calculated out here. If B2 is played, we can play bishop takes pawn, deflecting their king. And if the king takes back, then we win the pawn on B2. So they play rook A3. And now, this is a crazy looking sacrifice, but white did the math, calculated it out. They knew they could win this endgame if the two rooks and the bishop trade for rook and two pawns. White knew this would be a win because there's still the 3 connected pawns. And it would probably be a win even if it was just the 1 rook pawn, as long as our king could help box out the black king, or this pawn was fast enough. So 3 pawns, that's overkill, but it's plenty. And white just says, let's simplify this. Rook takes B3. After black takes, rook takes B3 again. Take, take, take. And now white cruised to victory here with 3 pawns. Very nice finish by white. Only needed the 1 pawn to make a queen. Come in for the checkmate. All right, so what were our key takeaways from this game? Number 1, castle early to keep your king safe. Number 2, having a plan for what you want to achieve, even if it's a simple one. So you always want to have multiple moves sort of planned out in advance. Here we had the bishop pair. We had the nice attack going. We were able to create problems for that black king in the center. Whereas if you look at what black was doing, they were doing a lot of pawn moves and a lot of 1-move threats. And I think that's kind of the highlight of an 1100 playing an 800, right? The 1100 just has a little bit more planning involved, and that 800 was focused too much on 1 move at a time. And then finally, when you get into that winning position, going into conversion mode, limiting the threats from your opponent, making that win easier. White did a great job of that in this game. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in game number 2.